Welcome to the State Procurement Office's workshop number SPO 200, the basics of procuring health and human services pursuant to HRS Chapter 103F. This workshop is the second of three parts. Part 1 provided some background information on the State Procurement Office and HRS Chapter 103F, purchases of health and human services. Part 2 will provide a brief overview of HRS Chapter 103F, its statutes, and administrative rules. Part 3 will cover resources for you to refer to when planning and preparing your service procurement. Health and Human Services is defined in HAR Chapter 3140 as services to communities, families, or individuals which are intended to maintain or improve health or social well-being through methods including, but not limited to, A. Assessment, treatment, diagnosis, prevention, and education services provided directly to a target clientele, or B. Insurance coverage for assessment, treatment, diagnosis, prevention, and education services provided directly to a target clientele. So how do you know if a procurement is subject to HRS Chapter 103F? First, the procurement must be for services as opposed to goods. Second, the service must be intended to maintain or improve health or social well-being and may include assessment, treatment, diagnosis, prevention, or educational services. Third, the service is to be provided directly to a targeted clientele. One way to determine if it's a 103D or 103F procurement is generally 103D is for operations of the state and 103F is services to the public. But there are instances where services fall in a gray area, meaning it could be both a 103D or 103F. When in doubt, call us and we can help you determine whether the service is a 103D or 103F service. The Hawaii Revised Statute provides the authority and lays the foundation for agencies to do what they do. For purchases of health and human services, there are 5 parts to HRS Chapter 103F statutes. Part 1 is General Provisions, Sections 103F-101 to 103F-106. Included in this part are application of the chapter, definitions, education and training, exemption from Chapter 103D, preventing impairment of federal funds, and authority of the Procurement Policy Board. Part 2 is the Planning Organization, Sections 103F-201 to 103F-203. Included in this part are the Interagency Committee on Purchase of Health and Human Services, Community Council, and Collaboration of Providers. Part 3 is on Procurement Organization, Sections 103F-301 to 103F-302. Included are the power and duties of the administrator and delegation of authority of administrator of the State Procurement Office. Part 4 covers source selection and contract formation, Sections 103F-401 to 103F-414, which includes the 5 methods of selection, which are competitive, restrictive, treatment, small purchase, and crisis purchase of services. Part 4 also includes amendment and cancellation of requests, modification and termination of contracts, types of contracts, multi-term contracts, multiple awards, timeline, interim measure of assuring continuation of services, and allotment. Part 5 is on protest, Sections 103F-501 to 103F-504, and includes protested awards, right to request reconsideration, award of contract, suspended during a protest, and exclusivity of remedies. Now let's cover the Hawaii Administrative Rules, which establishes the procedures or processes that the statute allows. Chapter 103F Administrative Rules are divided into 10 sections, We will look at each chapter briefly in ensuing slides. H.R. Chapter 3140 is on definitions. We'll cover just a few of the definitions within this chapter. The administrator is the administrator of the State Procurement Office. The Chief Procurement Office, of which there are 21 in the state and counties, are those officials designated by HRS Section 103D-203. Contracts are all types of agreements, no matter what they're called. Purchase orders, memorandum of agreements, memorandum of understanding are all contracts. Procurement officer is the person who has delegated authority from the head of the purchasing agency or the CPO or their designee to enter into and administer and make written determinations with respect to contracts. Public funds are considered to be any combination of funds from federal, state, or local government sources, and a request for proposals is a solicitation for providers to respond to by way of a proposal which provides a detailed plan to provide health and human services to the public on behalf of a state agency. H.R. Chapter 3141 is on general provisions. Subchapter 1 is the purpose and scope, which is to simplify, clarify, and modernize procurement laws, have continuous development of procurement policies and practices, have consistent, fair, equitable application of the laws and treatment of all providers, maximizing the purchasing value of public funds, fostering broad-based competition and providing safeguards for procurement quality and integrity. Subchapter 2 is general grounds for rejection, failure to cooperate or deal in good faith, an inadequate accounting system. Subchapter 3 is record keeping. It talks about retention of procurement records, provider retention of books and records, which is 3 years, confidentiality. Confidentiality is also referred to in HER Chapter 3143, an existing law governing information practices. Subchapter 4 is general operating procedures. It talks about list of providers, cost principles, no exemption from laws governing treatment of persons with disabilities, no exemption from anti-competitive practices, selection of procurement methods, availability of forms, and public notice. This is also covered under HAR 3141-407. Subchapter 5 covers waivers and exemptions, and Subchapter 6 covers procurement violations. We'll go over a little bit more about these in the following slides. In the statutes, HRS Chapter 103F S101, exemptions are 1. Contracts to award grants or subsidies of state funds appropriated by the legislature to a specific organization or individual. These are grants and subsidies which fall under HRS Chapter 42F. Item 2. Transactions between or among government agencies, included but not limited to agreements, contracts, and grants. These are transactions between state agencies, state, city, state to state, or between any government entities. Item 3, transactions that the Chief Procurement Officer determines are exempt under rules adopted by the Policy Board. This is covered under HAR Section 3141-503. These are written requests by department heads and submitted to the CPO for approval. Subawards and sub-grants to organizations directed by the funding source. These are usually federal awards directed to a specific provider. Grants and subsidies as defined in HRS Chapter 42F. These are grants and subsidies appropriated to a specific provider under HRS Chapter 42F. Next, affiliation agreements with hospitals and other healthcare providers required for UH clinical programs, and services of psychiatrists and psychologists in criminal and civil proceedings required by court order or rules of court. Under the exemptions section of the administrative rules, there are certain federally funded contracts which are exempt from Chapter 103F. If federal conditions conflict with Chapter 103F and its rules, then the federal conditions supersede HRS Chapter 103F. If the federal program for Health and Human Services identifies a target population, defines the requirements for a provider to be qualified to participate in the federal program, and the price of the Health and Human Services is dictated by federal law, then it would be exempt from 103F. But in order to be exempt, all three conditions shall be met. Yes, the target population and provider qualifications are seen in federal program requirements, but hardly does the federal government dictate the price. Like statutes, the rules provide exemptions by written CPO approval. Procurement violations are also covered under HAR Chapter 3141. Procurement violations occur when an agency fails to follow procurement statutes and rules. When that occurs, the agency with a procurement violation needs to report the violation and address the corrective action to prevent future reoccurrence. For the executive branch, Procurement Violation Form SPO 16 would be submitted to the State Procurement Office Administrator, who is the Executive Branch Chief Procurement Officer. These are just a few examples of procurement violations that have been reported. Failure to post procurement notice. Failure to extend the contract prior to expiration. Extending a contract when the contract does not allow it. Failure to request extension of time on a CPO-approved exemption. Requesting an after-the-fact restrictive exempt CPO approval. Federal grant application, which requires naming providers. There is no request for information that was done, or failure to submit a request for exemption or restrictive request if not doing an RFI. Exceeding the small purchase limits, adding services that are beyond the scope of the contract, or using a government-to-government exempt contract as a pass-through to a particular provider to evade competitively procuring the services. The next chapter of the administrative rules is HAR Chapter 3142 on planning. There are various activities which are part of the planning process to determine the services to be procured. These include the request for information, the RFI, each other, meaning purchasing agency to purchasing agency, collaboration with providers, meaning working towards the good of the public. You can also refer to PANS, which is the Procurement Awards Notices and Solicitation website. There, you'll find procurement notices on the Procurement Notices website, Request for Proposals website for Health and Human Services, RFPs, which goes back to 2004, and Awards Contracts Database, where you can find contract information, the department, the service, the provider, contract period, funding amounts, and point of contact information. The links to the procurement notices and the awards contracts database are located on the SPO homepage. The Health and Human Services RFPs can be found under the Health and Human Services section of the SPO website, or on the SPO homepage, do a search for RFP website. Request for information, RFIs. RFIs are used to obtain feedback from providers and any other interested party. Purchasing agencies are required to conduct at least one RFI when preparing for an RFP. If it's a new service or an existing service with many modifications, then purchasing agencies may issue as many RFIs as necessary. In an RFI, the purchasing agency would be describing the information being sought and establish the procedures for responses. HAR Chapters 3143 to 147. There are 5 methods of procurement under HRS Chapter 103F, and these 5 methods are the competitive, using the request for proposals process; restrictive, also known as sole source; treatment, small purchase; and crisis, also known as an emergency purchase. The competitive purchase of services is covered under HAR Chapter 3143. This is the method of procurement which is used most often for purchases of health and human services, using the RFP process for selecting and contracting. We will cover the competitive method of procurement in workshop number 215, the RFP process, 220, evaluating proposals for an RFP, and 225, RFPs, getting from a notice of award to an executed contract. A public notice is required to be posted for the competitive purchase of service method of procurement. The contract term is addressed in the RFP, and doing an RFI is mandatory. The competitive purchase of service method of procurement is protestable. This is the flow chart of the competitive purchase of service process. This is a quick overview of the competitive method of procurement process. First, as part of the planning process, you are required to do a request for information. Next, you would be putting together the RFP. A public notice needs to be issued and an orientation conducted. The proposals are received, and a register of proposals received are kept. Proposals are evaluated, and the notice of award, which is also statements of findings and decisions, are issued. If there's no protest, then awards are posted and a contract is issued and executed. If there is a protest, then all processes are suspended until the protest is resolved. The protester can submit a request for reconsideration from the CPO if the protester does not agree with the decision of the head of the purchasing agency, and the decision of the CPO is final. You can obtain a copy of the flowchart from the SPO website. On the home page, search keyword flow. Under HAR Chapter 3143, Competitive Purchase of Services, an expedited procurement can be done for certain types of federal funding. As a whole, applying for federal funds does not exempt the purchase from being competitively procured under 103F. If the federal funds received do not require you to name a specific provider, then you shall procure competitively unless an alternate method is allowed by statutes or rules. However, if the federal program specifies that when applying for a federal grant, the application requires a provider or providers to be named in the application, or there is a greater chance of being awarded a grant if a provider or providers are named, then you are able to use this expedited method, which is doing an RFI pursuant to HAR Section 3142-202. Chapter 3143 also covers public inspection of competitive purchase of services records, HAR Section 3-143-616. Records are available for inspection to the extent permitted under current law governing information practices after execution of a contract or contracts by all parties. The Office of Information Practices provides forms for release of public document information. OIP's contact information is provided on this slide. Restricted purchase of service, otherwise known as sole source, is covered under HAR Chapter 3-144. The basis for a restricted purchase includes, but is not limited to, 1. The service in a particular geographic area available from only one provider. 2. Service with a unique cultural approach designed for a limited target group available from only one provider. 3. Only one provider satisfies limitations imposed by funding source. It's a quantity issue and not a quality issue. If the provider is the best or the best suited, then that's quality and you should be procuring it competitively. It is not a restrictive purchase. If the provider is the only one that can provide the service, then that is a quantity issue. To request a restricted purchase of service approval, the head of the purchasing agency does a written determination and submits it to the CPO for approval. The request is posted for a minimum of 7 days prior to CPO action. In the case of the executive branch, the State Procurement Office posts the request. A restricted purchase is not always easy to justify or prove, and it is the responsibility of the purchasing agency to do its due diligence to show that the provider is the only one. Justification and documentation must be provided along with the request. Here is a flow chart for a restricted purchase of service. First, the head of the purchasing agency makes a written determination. Then the request is submitted to the CPO. The CPO posts the request for a minimum of 7 days before any action is taken. If there is no protest, then the purchasing agency shall post the award to the award database and award and execute the contract. If there is a protest, then like protest for the competitive method, the process comes to a halt until the protest is resolved. You can obtain a copy of the flowchart from the SPO website. Again, on the home page, do a search for keyword flow. The treatment purchase of services is covered under HAR Chapter 3145. The chapter can only be used when all three of the following criteria are met. 1. The services are for $100,000 or less. 2. The contract term is for 1 year or less. And 3. Service is only needed sporadically, or the problem would be worse if the service is competitively procured. It is for temporary services only. If the service is for a term longer than 1 year, then another method of procurement needs to be utilized. Also, if it's a service that a purchasing agency uses only a few times each year, however, the same services are used year after year, then the service is a planned purchase and must be procured through another method of procurement. And if the services are critically threatening health, life, or safety, then the crisis method of procurement should be used. This method was used very little throughout the years because other methods of procurement are available to purchasing agencies. Therefore, there is currently no treatment list available. This is the flow chart for treatment purchase of services. Requirements are submitted to the State Procurement Office. The State Procurement Office issues a public notice for statements of qualifications. Evaluation committees are formed to evaluate the statements of qualifications received. A simplified list of providers is compiled, and as the need arises, purchasing agencies utilize the list. Small purchase of services are covered under HAR Chapter 3146. Small purchases are purchases totaling less than $25,000 during any 12 consecutive month period. 103F's $25,000 threshold is tied into statute. Small purchases generally means obtaining 3 quotes, although not all small purchases require written quotes. Agencies are encouraged to always get quotes in writing since there needs to be a record of the quotes received in the procurement file. Here is the flow chart for small purchases. The purchasing agency determines that the services required will be less than $25,000 for any 12 consecutive month period. Quotes are obtained and evaluated. The award needs to be posted on the awards contracts database and awards. You can obtain a copy of the flow chart from the SPO website. Again, on our SPO homepage, search keyword flow. HAR Chapter 3147 covers crisis purchase of services. Crisis purchase of services are services for crises that seriously threaten life, health, or safety, are not already available, and it's needed immediately. Both of the following must be met. The crisis results from domestic violence, physical or mental illness or injury, homelessness, etc., and results in a serious threat to life, health, and safety. And second, the crisis generates an immediate and serious need for health or human services that cannot be met by any other purchasing agency that provides health and human services or under other provisions of HARS Chapter 103F. You must remember that the crisis must be the client's crisis and not yours. Running out of funds is not a crisis, and lack of planning is not a crisis for the purposes of this method of procurement. Here is the flow chart for a crisis purchase of services. The head of the purchasing agency determines that crisis services are required. CPO approval is required, but if it's not possible to get approval before the fact, then the services can be procured and the CPO request for approval submitted after the fact. Obtain as much competition as is practicable. The award is required to be posted on the awards contracts database. You can obtain a copy of the flowchart from the SPO website. Again, on the home page, search keyword flow. HAR Chapter 3148 covers protests and requests for reconsideration. There are only 2 methods of procurement that are protestable: the competitive and restrictive purchase of services. Under HRS Chapter 103F, there are only 3 things that can be protested, and that is that the purchasing agency did not follow statutes, rules, or the RFP. All protest forms are located on the SPO website. On the SPO homepage, search keyword protest. The protest and request for reconsideration flowchart provides a quick glimpse of the process. The purchasing agency, 1, sends out the statement of findings and decision. Then, 2, the protester submits a notice of protest. 3, a settlement and scheduling conference is held. 4, requests and responses for clarification are done. 5, the protester submits a formal protest. 6, the purchasing agency responds to the formal protest. 7, the protester replies. 8, the head of the purchasing agency makes a decision. 9, the protester, if not satisfied, can request for reconsideration from the Chief Procurement Officer. And 10, the Chief Procurement Officer issues a decision. You can obtain a copy of the flowchart again from the SPO website. Keyword flow. The last chapter of the rules, HAR Chapter 3149, covers contracting. The chapter covers contracts subject to availability of funds, contract requirements, termination of contracts, extension of existing contracts, use of multi-term contracts, contract amendment, parceling, and finally, monitoring and evaluation of contracts. That brings us to the close of Part 2 of the SPO Workshop 200.